Hey everybody, this is Jonathan Miller with the Hometown Historian channel. Today we are starting a new series as promised for here for a while. I finally came up with a name that I'm happy with. Uh, it's called Memories of Hometown Heroics, a journey into times of war. So this series is going to concentrate primarily on times of war, stories, which we're going to be starting. This first episode is going to be about the 1st Minnesota Regiment in Gettysburg and their heroic charge, and just in general. They their service throughout the war was exemplary. And so we want to explore that, talk about, not glorify war or anything like that, but just talk about these moments of absolute courage and the necessity at times. Nobody, I think, for the most part, wants war. War is an ugly thing that man was never meant to participate in, but unfortunately found themselves rather adept at. And there always will be evil men, and there will be times that good men and women have to stand up to these evils. And it's just the unfortunate aspect of our world that exists. But there are stories out there that really did change the course of history, and I feel like with this 1st Minnesota Regiment charge, probably if they hadn't done it, if they had decided they didn't want to do it or whatever, it could have changed the course of the world. And we'll talk and go more in depth in that. Some of the other stuff that we'll be doing with this series will be checking out museums. We'll also be going to small town, hometown monuments and memorials, and just talking about honoring these individuals. So if I see one along the road, be like, hey, you know what? I'd like to stop there. We'll do that, and we'll go from there. But yeah, I think it's going to be a really, really cool series. It's another one that will be of note. And you think about a lot of times in our history, some of the, I don't want to say more noteworthy, but some of the more nostalgic time periods, as awful as they were times of war. I mean, you really think about how communities came together. Everybody supported one another. They were supporting their young men and women that were off at war, whether it be times of the Civil War, World War One, World War Two, and to more recent. I remember when Persian Gulf War went on. I was only like 12, somewhere in that range, and I remember I made flags up of all the countries that were in the Allies and put them up there and really followed it. And I had the Desert Storm trading cards and things like that, which you think back in a way, sort of like it was a form of patriotism, but it was still sort of like you're profiteering off of war. But it was something to hold on to, something that was tangible, that you felt that connection to the individuals that were over there. And so it's always been like my dad was a veteran of World War II. He fought in the Pacific. His best friend got killed in D-Day. So it was something that had a huge impact on him. We went to the Gettysburg National Cemetery and we visited his graveside, and it's something that always will have an impact. Like, I think everybody has a connection to that in some degree. So this is a series that sort of, it envelops what we're trying to do with the Hometown Historian channel, and really shows how we are all connected. And despite our differences and things like that, our similarities, and those are the things that connect and bind us by the very fibers of our being. So that's what this series is about. I'm excited about doing this. I want to say thank you to Kim for getting me this first story, the 1st Minnesota. I'll be doing a lot off of that. I've also done a bunch of other research and all that. So I'm looking forward to doing this video, and I hope you guys enjoy this adventure. And I do want to say thank you to all of those of you that have served our country. Thank you. We will be doing stories at times, probably from other countries as well. So, like right now, primarily it would be based in America. But there are obviously a lot of other stories as well that I'd like to talk about, and we'll be doing that because hometown is everywhere across the world. So it will be more than just America. But being that I'm from the United States, a lot of the stuff that I'll have will probably be from around here and that type of stuff. But I'll also do stuff like potentially the Light Brigade, talk about that, maybe even read that, some things of that nature, because it has to do with the overall courage of these individuals that have fought in these wars and battles and have dealt with circumstances that are just beyond comprehension. So, with that, I want to say thank you for coming along, and let's start this new series, Memories of Hometown Heroics, a journey into times of war. Thanks, everybody. Hi, everybody. So we're here with the first episode of Memories of Hometown Heroics, a journey into times of war. And this is once again thanks to Kim. He sent me this really cool letter that has all this information. So just to give a little bit of backstory of the 1st Minnesota. They were actually, I believe, the first volunteer regiment in the Civil War. The governor of the state happened to be in Washington when everything went down with Fort Sumter. He offered up 1,000 men. They signed a 5-year contract, I guess you could say, to serve, which was much longer than most states had at the time. And they actually experienced several battles before now, well, quite a few battles where they had pretty decent sized losses. Battle of First Bull Run or Manassas, I think they suffered 20% losses. The Battle of Antietam, 28% losses. Gettysburg would be a whole different monster, and it was specifically because of the charge that they made. So just a little bit of the story of what caused this problem. So we got the information from Kim, and he was a reenactor for 12 years. He also had the privilege, he said, that of being part of a really cool overnight field trip to Gettysburg for 10 years for 6th grade, and because of his reenacting experience and being an employee of the school district. So one of the stories that he always would tell was this brave charge of the 1st Minnesota. So where this all started is with Dan Sickles. And Dan Sickles was one of those guys that he was sort of, he was an interesting guy. He was from the political machine in New York City, and he wasn't necessarily a guy that listened at all times. And George Meade had given semi-vague instruction that he could do what he wanted, but within reason. And Sickles decided, he was on the far left side of the line. He decided to move his troops without exact permission. It was sort of, I guess he said something, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense, and they obviously did not want him to move his troops that far forward. So what happened to cause this particular situation is a General Geary was to the right of where Sickles' men were, and George Meade had come in on the second day, late, I think it was late in the first day. He had gotten there in the night, and he talked to all his generals and his officers to get a general idea of where he stood. He decided this is a good place to stay, we've got the high ground, and he decided, though, he wanted to move General Geary's troops to the right side of the land on Culp's Hill, and this would leave a slight gap between General Sickles, who was on the far left of the line, their flank, that he would have to move the troops inwards to sort of make up that ground with their reserves. Well, General Geary, before he moved, he sent word to General Sickles. And General Sickles, who had just woken up, basically told the aide, "Go away, I haven't even had my coffee yet." So the aide came back to General Geary and said, this is what happened. So General Geary sent somebody else. Basically the same thing happened. He's like, yeah, I'll get to it. You know, the movements like that. So once he finally woke up, Sickles basically looked at his line where he was, and he didn't like it. He felt that his troops would be better off further forward. Problem is he basically disengaged his troops from the normal line and push them too far forward. But he did send word to Meade. He said, hey, because General Geary's like, I got to leave. And he sent word to General Meade, who was in charge of the forces, and said, listen, this is what happened. Sickles is basically an idiot. And so Meade sent somebody to him, and I guess Sickles sent word back and said, hey, I'd like to move my troops. I want your permission. So Meade sent back, within the parameters of what your original orders were, you may move your troops as you see fit. That was not him saying, hey, move your troop way forward and off the line. He meant to move them along the line to sort of clean in that gap that would have been there where Geary's troops had been. So that's what happened that led to this situation. So because of the misinterpretation of Sickles basically deciding he can do what he wants, he moved his men as about 100 yards forward, and immediately it started battle, because Meade had thought the battle would start soon, but not that soon. So as soon as the shots started being fired, he rode over to where Sickles was, realizing immediately, he said to Sickles, like, your troops are too far forward. Sickles also realized, I messed up. This was a bad idea. And he's like, should I pull back? And Meade had said to him, he's like, no. He's like, they're not going to allow you to do that. So he's like, I'm going to go get help to help fill this gap. Hold on for as long as you can. So the wing commander was General Winfield Scott Hancock, and he came over, was seeing what was happening, and at this point their reserves were running very thin. So he went to a group of men cresting a hill, and he didn't know it was the 1st Minnesota, but he saw their colonel, and he's a man named Colville, and he could see that the enemy was about to fill the hole that existed in the Union line that had been caused by Sickles doing what he did. And he realized how devastating it would, and he pointed to the enemy coming quickly their way, and he said, Colonel, do you see those colors? And that's the flag bearers of the opposing regiment. And Colville quickly answered yes. He said, take them. Colville turned to his men and asked, will you follow me? Just so cool. Just, I'm going. Are you guys coming with me? And the men, without hesitation, 272 men, they jumped into action. They marched quickly, turning double-quick charge bayonets. At full run, the men charged into 1,500 rebel fighters. Without firing a shot, they hit the front line of the enemy, who of course was firing at the charging threat, and greatly diminishing the 1st Minnesota. This regiment, they effectively slowed the line of rebels just long enough, and that's all they were looking for, is basically that they'd be able to sort of give them enough time to get the reinforcements that were coming from a distance to clean that up, and give time as Sickles' troops retreated, they'd fill in that hole. And then also they'd have to, when General Warren realized that Little Round Top, they had to get there as well, those regiments went up there as well. And it gave them about 5 minutes, and the reinforcements were able to show up and basically stop the Confederates, and the remaining Minnesotas were able to get back to safety. What Hancock had asked them to do, they did, but at an enormous cost. Of the 272 men who made the charge, only 47 made it back unscathed. This was a loss of 82%, which was the greatest in the war. And the thing is, you think about, it said a member of the 1st was later asked, quoted as saying, when the order was given to charge, every man knew what the order meant, death or wounding to everyone, and not a single man hesitated. That's the story of the brave charge of the 1st Minnesota. Now, to give it context, like historical context, the Confederacy at that stage was winning the war, and even the first day was sort of a standstill. It didn't really go one way or the other, but you could say Confederacy might have done slightly better. But considering what the Union troops had there on the first day, it was actually pretty impressive. if they had not made that charge, or they had hesitated, and the Confederacy had broken the left flank of the Union Army, there's a good chance Gettysburg would have been lost. And with the Union being in their own territory, the Confederacy being that far north, it would have opened Harrisburg up to them, which is the capital of Pennsylvania, still is. Also, probably would have opened up Washington, D.C. And there's a good chance before Ulysses Grant took over that Union would have had to lose the war, because they would have had no choice. The South would have, it just, instead of outlasting the South, it would have been done right there and then. So you think about 50 years later, if the Confederacy is still a Confederacy and the Union is still the Union, so we have a split United States, would we have helped in World War One? I think the war would have ended at some point, but until the U.S. entered the war, it was just a standstill. And then it started to move forward, and it forced Germany to capitulate. Now the question is, how would that have changed things? Would World War II, would Adolf Hitler have been able to gain power because Germany had to surrender, and there was so much anger because Germany had basically been destroyed economically? Maybe that would have been completely different. But the real question, I think, more so is, if it would have been inevitable that Adolf Hitler would have reached power, and Mussolini and some of these other leaders, and we would have had World War II, would the United States have been there to help Great Britain and France and Australia, Canada, and all these other countries that were at war with Germany, the European powers? Would we have a very different world right now, because United States strength would have been cut in half? So this charge, and maybe it's not the case, and it's like maybe things would have been brought back together via diplomacy or whatever, but it's just saying, like, a moment in time, how if things had gone vastly different, we could be living in a completely different world today. And that shows the courage, not only in that moment, of these men to be willing to die for a cause, for their fellow man, but also willing to die. And I'm sure in that moment it was not paramount in their thought, but willing to die to save the world, not knowing how big that moment could have potentially been. So these moments of heroics really are, in ways, when you dig a little deeper and look at it a little deeper, you say, this was a lot bigger than maybe even how it's viewed in a lot of ways. But regardless, it was just, if you're looking at it just in the moment, what a heroic moment. And just not to hesitate. Every man was like, will you follow me? Boom. Never fired a shot, just went right in with bayonets, knowing they were going to die. And Colonel Koval was one of them that got injured pretty severely. Really, it's impressive. So it's like, if you ever get a chance to go to Gettysburg, visit the 1st Minnesota Regiment Memorial. They also have a thing in the state capital of Minnesota. They have a recognition of them as well. It's really an impressive group of individuals. So thank you for coming along. This is the first story that we're going to tell here in the Memories of Hometown Heroics, a journey into times of war. There's going to be plenty of other stories that we're going to be telling. This is definitely a great way to start this series. Thank you once again to Kim for sending this my way. I knew about it, but I didn't have as much of an appreciation to doing it and reading your letter. And your research, your knowledge on it was awesome in making this video possible. So thank you once again, and we will see you all about town. Bye.